Brent Porzio, TopVelocity.net, pitching analysis here of Mitchell. You're gonna walk him through this with Pro Player AI to look at his biomechanics coming out of leg lift. You can see a hard lean back towards the rubber. That can force you into hip abduction more than hip flexion. So and it can also push you to end of range into that hip to where you really can't keep moving forward and down at the same rate because you're so far leaned back. So trying to stay a little bit more neutral, trying to get more in hip flexion and not so much hip abduction is going to be key now, because you're going to see as the front foot opens, there is a push, there is some drive, definitely. But you can see at front foot, the hips are completely closed and the arm's not even fully cocked. So it really means there really isn't much rotation ready at this point. And when we land, we want the hips almost fully rotated. So we want to be in full hip rotation, and the arm should be cocked, ready to release with the trunk following that. So if we look at like the kinematic sequence, the first line is foot plant, the second line is maximum extra rotation, third line is ball release. We can see right here at foot plant, the pelvis rotation is slower than the torso rotation. We want the pelvis rotation higher. So we've got, considerably less rotation going on. And if we look on the picture here, the video, we can see the hips, and the line between the hips and torso is starting to turn red. And they're both turning red at the same time. That means they're both peaking in rotation at the same time. So if we watch here, we can see as we go through the kinematic sequence, the peaks to the trunk right here, that's the trunk peak, and that's also the hip peak. You can see they both come down together. So they're ramping up together and they're decelerating together into landing. We want them separated. So we want the hips peaking before the trunk, then the trunk peaking before the arm. So if we go back to this position here, that leaning too far back and abduction could have killed the hip rotation, because ideally we want to be sitting in flexion in the hip. So when we open and we go to drive, we extend the hip, and that creates the rotation. So it could be how you're loading into the hip, and then also how much power you're driving out of the back leg to power the hip. But you're definitely staying close. So we're not seeing you trying to rotate your trunk early, which is good. But like we said, as the trunk and shoulders rotate, they're rotating together. So we're not going to transfer energy as well. So you can see at maximum external rotation, here we can look at, say, the forward trunk angle, and we can see at maximum external rotation, which is right here, this first dotted line, the forward trunk is about 18 degrees. Not too bad, but we would definitely want something a little bit more. And if we can get a little more front leg extension to support that, that would be ideal. All the way into pitch release at about 32. Not bad on the forward trunk. It's just we don't really have much of a driving front leg to support that. If we could get some more trunk extension in the front leg, that would accelerate the end of the chain. That would accelerate the arm into more internal rotation. We can see the elbows still a little bit ahead. We're not starting internal rotation yet, so there definitely could be an acceleration energy there. So it really goes back to some of these initial movements. Loading too far back into hip abduction could be killing the hip rotation, because we're hitting front foot with very little hip rotation, with no hip to shoulder separation. And then as the hips and shoulders come around, they're coming around together, and we're not getting that separation and that peak of the trunk considerably more than the hip. And it's kind of killing that transfer and that acceleration of energy. So let's really just try to work on a better posture at a leg lift, more hip flexion. Don't lean over, get the head back, not over the the toes, and try to really develop some hip to shoulder separation is really going to be the key going forward.